Well, good morning and welcome to The Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Danny. I am one of the pastors here at our church and just excited and glad that you're here, that you're in worship with us today, especially if this is your first time. As Anne-Marie said, we're just so excited and glad that you're here. I think it takes a lot of courage to come and to try a new church, and so we're just honored that you would do that. And as we are kind of in the midst this week, we are in the middle of a sermon series called Tough Topics. And I think a tough topic sermon series could either be for you, this is the perfect time to come to church, or this is my biggest nightmare, right? We're going to talk about things that maybe are on the tip of your tongue, things you've been wrestling with, things you've been wondering about, maybe things you've also been trying to push to the side, I don't really want to talk about this. And we've talked and we'll talk about kind of a myriad of different things. And today's, I'm not really sure, how provocative it is to you. It may be something that you're looking at and you're like, this is something I've been wanting to dive into for a long time. Maybe you've already landed it, and I'm not sure where you are on that. But we're going to talk about the relationship between faith and science. Is there a connection between the two of those? Do they completely dispel the other one? Are they connected? What is actually the relationship between faith and science? Because depending on your upbringing, and we did this a little bit last week too, our upbringing somewhat informs how we think about this and respond to this. But maybe in your upbringing, you were taught that faith and science were completely at odds. There was no possible way for you to be a faithful, good Christian and also believe in science. And maybe you didn't grow up religious and you grew up very scientific and you're like, well, I'm a knowledge guy. And I can't be diving into that whole speculation thing, that faith thing. And I'm a twin. I've told you this before, but my twin brother and I were opposite sides of this spectrum for a little bit. I was I'm a pastor, so he probably cares about his faith. So I'm a faith guy in that regard. But my twin brother thought he was going to be a pastor, and then he saw an intersection between faith and science where there wasn't congruence in every sort of way. And he said, if everything I was told about faith is not true in this one thing, then none of it must be true. And he walked out of it and he said, I'm a science and data person now. He said they couldn't work together. And so I believe that is a false dichotomy, that there is no real need for us to ever have to do a sermon series on the relationship between faith and science. I think that they should be connected. And oftentimes I say, I'm not going to give you everything that I believe or tell you how to think. I'm not necessarily going to tell you how to think, but I'm going to give you what I really, truly believe in this, that the connection between faith and science is one that is wonderful, it's strong, and it's beautiful, and it actually can enhance our faith. So if I was going to give you our sermon in a sentence, if you're taking notes, you could write this down, but this is the core of where we're going to be going today, is that science does not diminish faith, it expands it, and it offers us a deeper understanding and appreciation for God's handiwork. Now, depending on, again, your upbringing, you might have been told that science diminishes God's handiwork, right? That if we have an explanation for how evolution came to be, or if we look at a story and it may not be exactly scientifically true, we look at it and we say, well, you know what? That means that faith is wrong and it diminishes God's work. Now, you may be on the other side. I remember when I started to learn more about science and the world got bigger for me, it got more expansive. I said, that's quite wonderful, actually. I looked at this and I said, this means that God is way smarter than me. And that's awesome, right? That is amazing. If God was as smart as me, I would say you probably shouldn't go to church, right? If this was the threshold of God's knowledge. But God is so much smarter, so much more expansive. And I think the more we dive into this, it actually gives us a greater lens and a greater view of God's handiwork. And I'll say off the onset, I'm not a scientist. And so I'm not going to be diving into really deep scientific things. But what I am going to be doing, I probably have a very similar vantage point and seat in the science community that many of you do. And I know we have very smart people here. We have a lot of scientists and people that are in that field. And so you maybe should be preaching the science side of this. But what I want us to be able to do is actually just look at how we can have a healthy and faithful connection between the two of these and realize that they do not diminish one another, but ultimately, again, they reveal the handiwork of God within all of this, which is what I hope. So, and you may be wondering, should we be talking about this? Here's a couple reasons why I think that we ought to be talking about this. Barna did a study on the state of science in Christian schools, where 40% of Christian school teachers said the debate over creation was a significant challenge in their context. So nearly half of people said that this was a significant thing, while the Pew Research Center did a study on science and religion where they said nearly 60% of Americans believe that science and religion are in conflict. And so you might be in here and be like, I don't see a conflict between those, or I don't see an issue, but upwards of 50% almost of our population in America sees this as something that is not connected and not congruent. And so in the same way that we talk about why to be invitational as Christians, because maybe there's people out there that don't live an inclusive or evangelical or invitational life, like we want to be able to be equipped in here to go share that outside of our walls. We want to be able to have the same conversation around faith and science. Like, how do we dive into this in kind of a faithful way, knowing that almost 50, almost 60% of our population, these different subsets, are having these conversations and view them as meaningful. And so to kick us off, what I would like us to do is, if you would just, and this is really truly 45 seconds, if you would turn to one person next to you, not two or three, one person next to you, and just share in a short elevator pitch, what was your upbringing around the conversation of faith and science? Were you told not to engage with it? Did you engage with it? Did you ever have this conversation? 45 seconds, what was your upbringing around the conversation between faith and science? Share that with someone next to you really quick. So again, I suspect that the energy in the room points to the reality that there are interest and excitement around this topic, differing opinions around this topic. Like, there is probably some diversity in how we engage in this. And so I spent the whole week trying to figure out, like, how do you go about talking about this? Especially we're in a series in the Gospel of John. So, like, how are we going to go through the Gospel of John and do this? And so what I wanted to do was try to look at this in the way that made the most sense to me, and hopefully this makes the most sense to you as well. And so we're going to be going through a couple of different things for us. But what I would say as the first and foremost, like if you're taking notes, again, you can write some of these things down. What I would say is that faith and science are not mutually exclusive. Like it's not one or the other. It doesn't mean that you have to have one and they can't have the other. There is a synergy between the two of these. And off the bat, that's like maybe seems really elementary or really fundamental. Like the reason we're starting with that is if we don't have that as our baseline, we don't really have a foot to jump on going forward. If we think that they have to be put in their different silos, that they can't exist together, then it completely blasts off our ability to have a connected and integrated conversation around these topics. And so I'm going to be in and out of some scriptures. They actually won't be on the screen today, but that's fine. But if you want to be with me, we're going to be in John 1, verses 1 through 3. And I'm going to read this to you. So hear these words and tell me if they sound scientific to you. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was God with the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him was made that, or nothing was made without him that would have been made. Does that sound scientific to anyone? Not really, right? I shouldn't have made you raise your hands, because if you're like the one person that sounded scientific, I would have like completely outed you. But so the reason I wanted to read that was this is John's Gospel's telling kind of the creation story, right? Kind of the origin of Jesus. And he uses the word, and what he's talking about is Jesus. So he's like, in the beginning was Jesus, and there's God, but God is Jesus, and they're all connected, and they're all together, and there's all this synergy happening here. Now, what I would say to you is we can look at this and read this, and maybe you have no biblical scholarly foundation. You might look at this and be like, this is probably not historical data. This is probably not scientific data that's happening here, right? But it's trying to tell us something important that's happening here. Now, there's other places in the Bible that are scientific, or that are archaeologically backed up, that are factual. A great example would be if we go to 2 Kings in the 24th chapter. There's a story of Jerusalem falling to King Nebuchadnezzar. This is not important at all or theological, but when I was in seminary trying to learn how to say Nebuchadnezzar or spell it, I broke it up into Nebuchadnezzar, and I have to work really hard to not say that when I say that to you. So King Nebuchadnezzar this is a real story, right? So this is a real factual story. And the reason I wanted to put this out, and again, if you want to look it up, it's in 2 Kings 24, verses 10 through 14, and it depicts the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, the king Nebuchadnezzar. And what's happening here is we see this is important for us to understand that there are things in the Bible that are archaeologically backed up. You can look at this, and there are different excavation and archaeological finds that point to finding arrows and stuff that were in the ground, finding burned buildings, finding other pieces of scrolls that are not biblical, that are extra biblical scrolls and historical documents that point to this being a historical event that is backed up archaeologically and with other scientific dating methods we can see like around the same time that this talks about. And the reason I bring that up, because it has nothing really to do with a spiritual topic that we're talking about, but it's to point out that when we go into the Bible is not all literal. The Bible is not all scientific. The Bible is not all poetic. The Bible is not all prophetic. It is a mixture of different sorts of literature put into one. The Protestant Bible, it's 66 books, and if you have a Catholic Bible, it might have more books. If you grew up in the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew Bible is just our Old Testament, but there's also extra books outside of that might have made it into it depending on your tradition. Depending on where you grew up, you might have anywhere from 66 or slightly more books in the Christian Bible. And the reason that I bring that up is like if you were like me when you were brought up, I was told that everything was like that story in 2 Kings. Everything was archaeologically backed up. Everything was literal. Everything was scientific. Everything was like this Old Testament story in 2 Kings. But when I go and I read 1 John verses 1 through 3, I don't hear anything that can be archaeologically or scientifically backed up. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, does that make it less valuable? And I would say the answer is no, that doesn't make it any less valuable. That doesn't make it any less valuable at all. It actually makes us as the readers, and this would have been the Jewish tradition, and as Jesus is starting the Christian movement, the way of Jesus, his tradition, they would have looked at these, and they would have not read them in a monolithic fashion that said one size fits all. This is all one book, that everything is the same. They would have said, what is this text trying to tell me? What is the author's agenda? And spoiler alert, authors had agendas as they were writing things. What are they trying to get across? How are they trying to tell us this? What are the devices of writing and authorship that they're using? What is going on in their space? And then as we read it, what is it actually telling us that's going around in here? In this John passage, N.T. Wright, if you know N.T. Wright, he's a Christian kind of evangelical theological theologian. And he says this about this 1 John passage. He says it's poetic and theological. It's meant to confound truths about Jesus' divinity and the integral role he played in creation. It emphasizes John's prologue as a declaration as Jesus as God and this divine reasoning and ordering behind the principles of life, right? And so when we see this, it's pointing to the creation story. It's pointing to the idea that there's ordering and there's reason and there's logic, but it's not something that actually is written in a factual way. It's poetic in nature. And you might be asking yourself, so why are we talking about this in a series and a topic talking about science and faith? Well, the reason is that when we look at the Bible, it's not a science book, right? It's not a science book. It's not a biology book. It's not a chemistry book. It's not even a history book, really, in many ways. And that's important for us to know because off the jump, even though these things aren't mutually exclusive, the Bible was never intended to be our main source of scientific knowledge, right? It wasn't meant to be where we went to figure out things like photosynthesis, which I still don't really understand. But I tried to find the answer in the Bible and I couldn't find it, right? So it's not where we're supposed to go for these scientific things. It's not where we're supposed to go for this, right? And actually, God of the Bible and God of science are not meant to be things that are at odds with each other, but they're supposed to work together with one another. Now, the second thing I would say is just in the way that they're not mutually exclusive, they're not meant to undermine each other. And those might sound similar to you. You might be like, well, of course they're not. If they're not mutually exclusive, then they're not undermining each other. But you've been in this conversation before, maybe around evolution and faith, right? One of these things is attempting to undermine the other in the rhetoric that we use, but in the principle of them, neither of them are trying to do that to each other. like being able to believe in evolution and being able to believe in God, those two things don't undermine one another. Like believing that we have a God that is so abundantly creative that there could be a way that life came to be over the course of many years and through this scientific way that expands past our thinking doesn't mean that it's digging at our faith. It might actually just be that we're getting ourselves a different vantage point at looking at this faith-related conversation. Now, if someone, maybe you've never heard these terms before, but one of the reasons when it comes to like faith and evolution, or Jesus and evolution, God and evolution, that these things don't work together sometimes is depending on what your worldview is on the creation story that we would read about in Genesis. And there would be some people that say like they would be early, I should have Googled this actually before I did this, but like early earthers or like young earth people, young earth believers, like that the earth is 6,000 years old, right? That the Bible would point to that as evidence. Now, when we look into the creation story, we don't actually see anywhere about it being 6,000 years old. And again, archaeological and scientific evidence would point to the contrary of that. And my wife and I, before we got married, we went to a church and visited it together, and they were preaching on Genesis 1. And the pastor stood up and he said, as everyone in this room knows, Genesis 1 is poetry. It's not meant to be read literally. And I'm like nodding my head and I'm going, and the guy keeps going, and my wife like elbows me on the side, and I'm like, she's trying to like create more room. And then she's giving it to me, and she's like, getting in my rib. I'm like, what do you want? And so I turn over to her and she's like, we don't all know that the Bible's poetry. Like, what is this guy talking, or that this Genesis story is poetic? Like, how am I supposed to believe this without the data and the principles to back it up, right? And so I bring that up to say this, like maybe you've heard someone say like, well, the creation narrative isn't meant to be read literal. And you're like, I will entertain that, but give me the evidence of why that's true, right? And maybe like it is really literal. Give me the evidence of why that's true. And what I wanted to do is give you the best version of evidence for why the earth is probably not 6,000 years old, and why that creation story probably shouldn't be read literally. So when we look at the creation story in Genesis 1, it's a profound narrative of the creation of the universe. That is what's happening here. And if we're looking at the whole purpose of the Bible, right? The purpose of the Bible is to draw us closer to God, to one another. The authors are trying to make order and meaning out of a world that looked orderless and meaningless. They were trying to create this going on. We actually see the creation story read in Genesis is found in other works throughout history and time. And so that means that other people may have written very similar things. Does that make it less meaningful? Does it mean it's less true? Neither of those things have to be true, but it means something. The data tells us it's out there. But when we look at it being poetic versus 100% scientific, here is why I would give this to you as that. Genesis 1 kind of features this paralleled poetic writing structure that goes on that kind of is indicated all throughout Hebrew poetry. And a lot of the Hebrew Bible is poetic. The New Testament authors must have like lost that passion for poetry. There's a lot less poetry in the New Testament. But the Old Testament, there's like a lot of poetic structure and writing that's going on into here. An example of this would be this. So in the creation story in Genesis 1, we hear a repeated phrase that says this, and God said on this side, and then it was so. And then it says, and then there was evening, and then there was morning, right? And you might be like, that doesn't sound like great poetry to me. I would agree, but I don't really understand poetry. So, but what I would say is there is this kind of like symmetrical poetic writing. Like you heard it this way, and then you saw it this way, right? On the first day there was this, and the second day there was this. In the morning there was this, and the evening there was this. And the reason that's important is like the structure and writing style of Genesis 1 is written like all the other works that are generally agreed upon to be poetic in nature. And we find that here in Genesis 1. And that's important for us to look at because if we're trying to find scientific evidence out of the creation story, then we might be looking for it to do the wrong function, right? We might be looking for it to do the wrong thing. Now, does it tell us the story of a God that loved God's creation, that created humanity, that had intention for humanity, that ordered humanity? Does it tell that story? 100% yes. And I actually would say this, like as I say these things, they give me absolute zero tension. I'm someone that loves to kind of like live in the gray. Like I don't need things to be binarily black or white. But I also know that some of you, like this may very well be the first time you've ever heard that said to you. that the creation story is not literal. It also may be the first time that you've ever heard that the whole Bible isn't exactly like literal word for word. Here's what I would say to you. Faith at its core is challenging. And walking with Jesus is challenging. And one of the values we have here, among others, is like we don't all have to agree on everything, but we have to have conversation in good faith about everything, right? And this is something that I would say, like, if you disagree with someone around you, and I suppose that in some of the conversations we had, like, we might have had people that had disagreements in this. As we go into these conversations, know that from my perspective, I'm not trying to convince you to change your mind. I'm trying to present you with what is the historical data, the facts, and what is kind of the devices that are being used within this. But in the early Christian tradition, the creation story was not one that was read as literal, which is very interesting to me. Because where are we at today? We're in 2024, right? And we have a lot of people that need that story to be literal. And that's fine if that's you. But I would ask ourselves, like, why did we get there? Because if you look back into the early Christian fathers, the people that are kind of building the church, one of which is Augustine. Augustine, in the early time, as he was doing this, he was like one of the foundational people that wrote prolifically about the creation and the life of the church. And he said that I got to find my quote here really quick, that Genesis was never meant to be a literal interpretation of the creation story. Rather, it was supposed to give us a logical framework for the sequence of creation. Now, is Augustine Jesus? No. Remember that. Anyone you read, they're not Jesus, right? So like we're going through his thoughts though, but this is someone that's closer to the early Christians than we are. And the earliest of earliest Christians, even going back to those that walked closely with Jesus, when they thought the creation story, they weren't necessarily looking at it to be this historical, literal story, but it gave them a logical, creative narrative for what was going on. Even if you remember, we had my good friend Rabbi Josh come and preach here about a year and a half ago. And this is a Hebrew scholar, a man of the Jewish faith, and he preached on Genesis 1:1. And he said that there were tons of different ways to do this, and most faithful Jews, whether they're very progressive or very conservative or somewhere in the middle, don't need or believe that creation story to be literal. And that was interesting, at the least, for me. And so as we look at this, it's like it's giving us this framework for the creative story, giving us order and giving us something to look at. But if you're like, I want someone a little more modern, still not that modern, but if you know the author C.S. Lewis, another kind of Christian author, someone that sometimes is painted as someone that might be on one side of a lot of theological arguments, well, he talks about the creation story as well. He says the first chapters of Genesis never intended to teach us science. They were intended to teach us that God created the universe, and this is the most important part, and how much God loved us. When we look at the creation story, like there are a lot of things that are happening in there, but the core of it is that there was a God that created the universe, and from the beginning of time, people were trying to make sense of that, make sense of something that was beyond our mental capacity. But what they could make sense of is that God created us and that God loved us. There were two things that we could make sense of, and there was a lot happening and swirling around that. And so, again, I would say, like, faith and science, they're not mutually exclusive. They also don't undermine each other. Like, I think that they can actually work together. The more we learn about science, the more we learn about God. It doesn't take away the power of God because we have really complex DNA. It doesn't take away the power of God because the theory of evolution may or may not be the way that things came about to be, right? Those things don't diminish God, but I think they actually bring us more, which would lead to the last thing. I think the connection between faith and science expands our understanding of God's wonder, at least for me. Like the more that I see a connection between the two of these, the more that my mind is blown. The more that I look around, I'm like, how great is God, right? And you've been in those moments, right? Like you're walking around and you're in the wilderness and you see a waterfall and you see the trees and you see the stars maybe if you're at night and you're like, someone created this, right? And then we start to see like there's science around stars and what those are, right? And how waterfalls and mountains are formed and the erosion process that goes into that. Like none of that makes me think God is less wonderful because there's a created order of how things come to be. But it gives me more conversational topic to have around these sorts of things. What I would say to you is this, that science and religion, they're not foes. They're not enemies. They're not meant to be against each other. They're actually connected in the common pursuit of knowledge. Like, both of these things are trying to pursue knowledge. Both of these things are trying to pursue truth at their core. And they're not enemies in this, but they're different lenses to view the nature of the seen and the unseen world, right? Science is very geared to helping us understand the existence in the world we live in. Faith is really important and necessary for helping us understand the ethereal world that surrounds us, the spiritual world within us and around us, and our connection to everyone. These things are not enemies, they're not foes. They actually give us a greater understanding of God's wonder. Now, challenge-wise, sometimes I give you guys like, go in your week and do this, or go in your week and do that. I'm going to give you a book to read. And I'm going to give you a book to read, so if you want to write this down, you can. But you may love it. You may be like, this is the worst book I've ever read, and I will never take another book club recommendation from Danny. But this is why I don't have an account on Goodreads, because not all my recommendations are great. But I would encourage you to read a book called What We Talk About When We Talk About God. It's a book by an author named Rob Bell. You don't have to agree or co-sign with everything he says, and I suspect you won't, actually. And this is what, like, do you ever read things you don't like? Like, just ever read things you don't like or disagree with? Like, you still have conversation afterwards, right? Or you'll like be driving in the car and you're like, hey, you remember that thing from that thing I hated? That was kind of an interesting idea, right? Like, so you don't have to agree with everything that you read in this. But I would encourage you to read What We Talk About When We Talk About God. It is a non-scientific person's attempt to look at really good science. And I say that because he's not a scientist. But he's trying to look at the world of physics and the world of other sorts of science and see the intersection of those. But he's a pastor and a theologian. He's trying to make sense of these things. And sometimes when we're going into this, and I think this is from this book, he uses like the analogy like that we're like swimming to what feels like a bottomless pit. It like gets darker and darker and darker. And we kind of have two options in this conversation. Do we turn around and swim back up to where we come from? Or the challenge is to keep swimming, believing there's something on the other side. And my challenge for you would be, like, whether you've been having this conversation for decades, whether this is the first time you've ever considered this, is to keep swimming through this topic. And whether you read this book or you pick up another one, have the conversation. I would argue in life and faith, never having the conversation doesn't turn out well. Like, sweeping it under the rug or ignoring it doesn't go well. But almost every time we have the conversation, something enlightening happens within us and other people. And so my challenge for you would be to dive into this. Because I think for a long time, like, the church said, we're not talking about this. And we do that sometimes. Like, if we're nervous, it's going to undermine, or it's going to push us, our belief system out, or we think it's going to replace us, we freak out. We say, I'm not going to dive into this. But my challenge would be, if you're about to go on vacation, or maybe you're like just a great reader and you bust books out in a week, or maybe you want to take the rest of the summer, find this book, go to the library, like, get it, read it, and I would love to have some conversations with you about it, because I think that there are some really interesting things that are happening there that God has to say to us. And then I would end with this. You might have been hoping for like a lot of really scientific data in this. And I'm sorry, I told you I wasn't a scientist. But what I did tell you that I hope we accomplished was we could better understand the relationship between these two things, that they're not combating each other, that they work together, that they can actually and ultimately reveal to us a greater understanding of a God that created and ordered things, a God that most importantly loves us, and that a God that is not intimidated by the intellect of our world, but actually encourages us to dive into it so that we might understand ourselves, God, and the universe even better. And so with that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I do thank you that you allow us to have conversations that are sometimes ones we've never had before, conversations that sometimes make us a bit uncomfortable. But ultimately, God, we know that in the conversations that make us uneasy, that make us uncomfortable, that stretch us a little bit, like that's where you're found. And so ultimately, I would ask you to just continue to challenge us to stretch ourselves and believe that in the stretching is where we find you. And so God, I just ask that your truth would stand true today, that your Holy Spirit would speak through us in the words we shared collectively, the words I've shared, the words we've sang, that they would point to a truth that does surpass all understanding, a truth that maybe is hard for us to quantify, but a truth that reveals to us that there's a God who loves us, knows us, and created us. And so be with us as we continue to worship through song, through word, and prepare our hearts to receive communion. Pray us all in Jesus' name. Amen.